Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Sorcery, the Magic of Extemp Sources, also known as Defense Against Alternative Facts. Hopefully this video this afternoon will help you as you are selecting what sources to put in your files for extemporaneous speaking, as well as what sources to use in your speeches for UIL. This quote speaks to me. I think it will speak to you as well. Having a large number of people in a society who are misinformed is absolutely devastating and extremely difficult to cope with. I think that Dr. Lewandowski knew what he was talking about when he said this, and this problem has only grown over the last several years. When we first started in Extemp, or when I first started in Extemp many years ago, we really had only 3 sources that everyone used. And those were Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. We didn't have big budgets, and we didn't have the internet. And so we would get these magazines and we would clip the articles from them, and that's what we used. If we were really lucky, we might snag a subscription to something like the New York Times or the Dallas Morning News, but for the most part, this is what everyone had in their tubs. Now, of course, we have the internet, and so the sky's the limit really on our sources and what we can use. There are lots of free newspapers and magazines that are available online, and computers are pretty cheap now, so there's no limit to what we can use. But that causes problems because we wind up with things in our sources that are not really the best sources, and they're highly biased. So we see things like wire reports that are very shallow, or we see opinion articles or blogs that are written either with no warrants at all or written by non-credible sources, or we have entire magazines or newspapers that are very highly biased. So our goals today in this session are to talk about some of the most commonly used sources and maybe find some less commonly used sources that could be helpful to us in our Extemp speeches. And we're going to talk about which sources we can use in a variety of situations, and then we'll do a little bit on recognizing and avoiding bias and misinformation, alternative facts. So I do want to say 2 things to you before we get started. And the first is that I'm not an expert. You do what works for you. And secondly, this is not an all-inclusive list. There are so many sources out there that I could never discuss with you in one workshop every single source that's an option in various areas. You do your own research, find out what works best for you and for your team. But primarily, your coach is the end decision maker on all of these things. So discuss with your coach if you want to use particular sources. So first, let's talk about why we source. So there's really 3 reasons. The first is to add credibility, so someone is supporting you in what you're saying. Secondly, sources can clear up some confusion. And third, sources can provide some empirical data and some statistics that will help you in your speech. But sources are not the be-all, end-all. Your source should not become all of your speech. Sources shouldn't provide all of your analysis. They shouldn't provide just a list of theories from experts, and they certainly shouldn't substitute for your own analysis. Your speech should be your thoughts, your reasoning, your argumentation with the sources to back that up and provide some credibility for you. So your goal is to integrate what the experts are saying into your analysis by reading bits and pieces of analysis from the experts and synthesizing, combining those theories into your own argumentation and your own analysis. And then you should always add your own personality to a speech. And you should definitely use your theories to guide your speech. So next, let's talk about fake news. Over the last several years, we have seen a rise of fake news, completely fabricated from whole cloth stories like these that have become so pervasive both in mainstream media and in social media that people are having trouble distinguishing between what's real and what's not. We see it a lot in social media, particularly during the election season, and a lot of memes like this one and this one are, most likely created by bots from other countries that are trying to actually influence our election. The problem is that a lot of people do not understand the difference and can't distinguish between what's fake news and what's real news. PolitiFact talks about this. They describe fake news as made up stuff that is masterfully manipulated to look like credible journalistic reports that are easily spread online to large audiences willing to believe the fictions and spread the word. Unfortunately, we have reached a point that a large number of Americans, more than 50%, think that mainstream media outlets often report something that is blatantly fake news. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but go home and talk about this with the other members of your team, ways that we can recognize fake news. Because I don't think fake news is the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem for extempers, and this is what we're focusing on today, is the bias of the news that we're consuming. Wikipedia defines media bias as the bias or perceived bias of journalists and news producers within the mass media in the selection of events and stories that are reported and how they are covered. It implies pervasive and widespread bias contravening the standards of journalism, not just the perspective of an individual journalist or article. Now, there are many different kinds of bias. Probably or possibly the most common one is confirmation bias, and that is I consume the media that agrees with what I already think. So depending on what I watch, what I read, I select news outlets that agree with me in making decisions. But there is bias on the part of the news media as well. Coverage bias, where the outlet selects issues that are already visible in the news. Agenda bias, based on their own ideology. Statement bias, where maybe they're covering the things, but they frame the stories so they're slanted toward a particular viewpoint. Then we have advertising bias, where they select their stories to please their advertisers, or corporate bias to please their owners. Mainstream bias, where they report on things that everyone else is reporting. Sensationalism, where they favor the sensational events. And this has happened for years. It's not new. We've seen coverage of the immigration issue from both the right and the left. Most recently, during COVID-19, I pulled these chyrons. Chyrons are that's this little thing that runs across the bottom of the news story while it's playing. That you can see, and I just picked the two big television outlets because the way that they report, both of these two, the way that they report really shows some bias. This is happening at the same time. Trump refuses to acknowledge mistakes versus Fox News, you're a fake. Angry Trump turns briefing into propaganda session versus Trump just wants to keep the media honest. We could go with these for days. They're reporting the news, but the way in which they're reporting the news is slanted toward the left or the right, depending on what their particular ideology is. So I'm going to offer for you 2 different online platforms that will maybe help you make some decisions about where the bias is and which direction these different news outlets are slanted. You cannot avoid bias in your consumption of the news. Almost every single news source is biased in one way or another. So this first one is the media bias chart. I don't know that I have the most recent one here for you, but if you'll do a Google search, you can find the most recent one. They update it pretty regularly. So, and keep in mind also that these are individuals who have created these 2 platforms, and so they may have some inherent bias as well. So you have to do your own research and figure out what you think is correct. But this particular media bias chart, they rank from top to bottom on original fact reporting down here toward inaccurate or fabricated information, from top to bottom. Then they rank from the middle, being neutral, all the way to the left, extreme liberal, and to the right, extreme conservative. So ideally, we would be looking for sources in this green box. And you see there's quite a few there, some of which we'll talk about in a few minutes as to why I would really recommend you staying away from things like AP and Reuters, in addition to things like C-SPAN and ABC News. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. But you'll also notice that the sources that are falling down here in this area of containing inaccurate and fabricated information are also falling to the far left and the far right on the chart. So we really don't have anything in the middle that is fabricated information, but also unbiased. So keep that in mind. So we want to stay really in the green or yellow boxes as we can. Then there's another platform called MediaBiasFactCheck.com. This is an independent online media outlet that looks at things like the bias of the wording, the factual information, and the sourcing of the information. So they provide not only true information, but they show where they got the information. Their story choices are unbiased, so they're reporting on stories on both sides of the issue, and they examine the content and the wording of the stories that each of the media outlets is putting out for political affiliation. So are they remaining unbiased in their content and their wording as well? And they rank, much like the chart did, they rank from least biased in the center to right and left extreme. So let's talk about some of the least biased sources on this chart. First, we've got the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a foreign think tank, pretty unbiased. China Daily falls in the middle. Little bit skewed left there, but not too badly. This is a daily Chinese newspaper. Any Chinese newspaper, if you're reporting on a Chinese source, you should be cognizant of the bias and really the Chinese government censors a lot of Chinese things. But the China Daily does a pretty good job with U.S. coverage if you're looking for an unbiased source there. Center for Strategic and International Studies, fairly middle of the road, very high factual reporting. This is a nonprofit policy research organization. Christian Science Monitor, high factual reporting. This is an international news organization. They have global coverage. Very slight left, but they're always factual. And I am a particular fan of the Christian Science Monitor because I feel like they do a really good job with their analysis. But I will caution you that at some point in your career as an extemper, you will run across a judge who tells you that you shouldn't be using the Christian Science Monitor because it has the word Christian. in its title. But I find the Christian Science Monitor to be one of the most unbiased sources that we have access to. Next is the Financial Times. This is an international daily newspaper. They obviously focus on financial issues, business and economic news, but they have reports on other things as well, and very little bias. Their editorial stance, in addition, ranges all the way from right of center to left of center. So they have folks on their staff on both sides of the political aisle. Foreign Affairs is an American journal of international relations and U.S. foreign policy. You can see it's just a bit right of center. Published bi-monthly by the Council on Foreign Relations. This is a good source for both foreign and U.S. Policy reporting. Foreign Policy is an American news publication, but it's focused on global affairs. A little bit right of center. Gallup is, you hear about Gallup most of the time because of their polls. And they do a great job with that. Really, really central here. It's an American-based consulting company that provides research to large organizations in many different countries, and they do a great job. The next is the International Business Times, which you can see is just a little bit left of center. High factual reporting. Sometimes you'll hear this called the IB Times or the IBT. They provide news and analysis on business and business-related stories. We've got the Pearson Institute for International Economics. This is a private nonprofit think tank focused on international economics and is ranked, has been ranked repeatedly in the top think tanks worldwide as well. And you can see it's just a little bit right of center. Pew Research, this is another polling organization that also provides stories and research on social issues, public opinion, and demographic trends that shape the U.S. and the world. Roll Call, pretty central. This tends to focus on Capitol Hill, but it is a solid just the facts news source. Their editorials do lean a little bit left. The Texas Tribune. I'm a big fan of this one because it reports Texas issues in a way that is easy to read and easy to keep up with and very, very unbiased. You can see they're really right in the middle there. They call it an alternative news source, but it's becoming more and more used. The Economist is another one of my favorites. You see it's just a little bit right of center. High factual reporting, and this is a good one because they staff their magazine with economists who can report the issues as they are happening. Now, it is an economic magazine, but they also do reporting on lots of different things, and they have great analysis as well. The next is the Jerusalem Post, which is a tiny bit left of center. Very high factual reporting. It will not surprise you to find out that they are biased toward Israel, but very centrist in global affairs. So take what you read about Israel with a grain of salt, but they do a great job with the rest of the world. The next is the Times of India, high factual reporting. They report on U.S. and international news. Again, you might find some bias where they're reporting about India, but otherwise very, very central. USA Today has the third largest distribution rate in the United States. It is a simple to read format for general audiences. That is important to remember because judges tend not to respect evidence that's coming from the USA Today just because it is written in such a simple to read format, but it's a great place to get started. And they do have a very slight left leaning in their editorial department. These sources are left of center, and you're going to see some that you use all the time. New York Times, Politico, Brookings Institute, The Guardian, U.S. News and World Report, The Hill. All of those are ones that get sourced all the time by extempers. And if you look to the right of center, you will see the same thing here. Washington Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Dallas Morning News. Okay, so am I telling you that you can't use these newspapers or magazines, or these newspapers or magazines? Absolutely not. What I am telling you is that if you use sources on this list, you should also use sources on this list. Why is that? Because it keeps your speech balanced. As I said, it's almost impossible to use only those sources that are least biased. There's nothing wrong with watching, reading, paying attention to any of the sources that fall to the left or right of center, as long as you balance your speech and you include advocacy from both sides. Then we get to the sources that have a strong left bias or a strong right bias. And I'm going to say the same thing about these sources. Read them, follow them, use them, but for sure, if you use from either one of these two lists, you really need to make sure that you're also using from the other list as well. We use the Heritage Foundation pretty frequently. It's one of our go-to sources, but we are always clear and sure that when we use the Heritage Foundation, that we balance it with a more liberal source as well. I would always tell my students to stay away from CNN and Fox News unless you're going to quote both of them in the same speech. So if you quote CNN, follow it immediately with a quote from Fox News that says the exact same thing. Or if you're trying to compare two different viewpoints, follow them back to back, but make sure your judge sees that you are balancing from both sides of the aisle. So let's talk about some things to consider when you're selecting your sources. First, let's talk about these things that we call the big three that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. There was a time when Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report were the go-to sources. They cover all the issues. They're easy to read. The problem is that they provide some pretty weak analysis because they're really just reporting the news. And these three sources do not go into the depth of analysis that you need to give an advanced extemp speech. Sometimes they're great for beginners because they're easy to read and understand, but the farther you get, and the better you get, the more will be expected of you in terms of your sources. So spend your time, which is limited, on more substantial sources and stay away from these three. So what are some of the things that I think you should consider when you're selecting your sources? Look for sound information and depth of analysis. So go back to that mediafactcheck.com that we talked about a few minutes ago. Do some research. Figure out which sources you like that provide factual information and deep analysis so that you can use those in a more advanced extemp speech. Look for sources that demonstrate a specialty in a field or region, and we'll talk about some of those just in a minute. Look for sources with expertise that is not found elsewhere. I mentioned The Economist, how they staff their newspaper, their journal, magazine with economists. Find those kinds of sources so that you have that depth of information that's not really available anywhere else. I already mentioned that I think you should cite sources from both sides of the political spectrum. Consider the credentials of the authors. I'm not the judge who is looking for you to tell me the name of every author that you use in an extemp speech. However, if you're quoting from an article in The Economist and the author of that article was a well-known and well-respected economist, and I'm going to know the name of that person, then credential that person. But you don't have to tell me that this particular newspaper journalist wrote the article, because that doesn't mean anything to me. But the credentials of your authors could mean something to you as you are selecting your sources. So if, let's say, for example, you find a blog that was written by a former Secretary of State, and he is writing on a political issue that affects the international community. That blog could be used as a source because that source, that author, is a respected expert in his field. If you find a blog that was written by some high school student somewhere, or even a college student or a teacher or someone that's just sharing their opinion, that's not a blog that I would use as a source because that person's not an expert in that field. So consider the credentials of the authors as you save articles. Avoid sources that use their own reporters as evidence. So I mentioned CNN and Fox News a while ago. Those two particular organizations are very, very bad about this particular thing. They'll bring in their reporters to interview about something that's going on in the world. Well, just because you're a reporter on something doesn't make you a good source on that thing. So if you had to ask me what sources I think are essential, I would start with this list. If you are limited in time and you just don't have the teammates or the time or the money to spend on an autofiler, these are the 8 sources that I think you should start with. This is what I always make sure we have in our files. So there's the New York Times. And I think it's important, even though it does have, a pretty significant liberal bias, it is considered still to be the newspaper of record for the United States. And it's a respected source for both national and international news. Just keep in mind that liberal bias and balance it with something from the right side of the spectrum. We already talked about the Christian Science Monitor, great depth of analysis, really well-rounded approach, and they're particularly good at spotting trends in politics, business, industry, and culture. And so you'll see something that they report on maybe later developing into a bigger issue. The Washington Post is considered the Washington Insider. They cover both politics and national news, and they also have pretty decent coverage of international affairs. They have 16 foreign bureaus. It does tend to have a little bit of a liberal slant, and so keep that in mind as you're using some of their investigative journalism into what's happening in Washington, that they may have an agenda there. The Wall Street Journal, New York-based, tends to focus on the stock market and economic issues, but they also report on other issues that may affect the economy, so it's a good one for that. The Los Angeles Times is one of the most respected national papers in the United States. Slight liberal leaning, but this is a reliable source that you can use on almost every topic. Foreign Affairs is the journal of foreign issues in the United States and the world. It covers U.S. foreign policy goals and interests and trends in world politics. And many of their articles are written by well-known and well-respected political scientists and international affairs experts, so you can count on what they're saying. And a lot of times their articles just stay relevant for many years after publication. We've already talked some about The Economist. It is the Bible of foreign and domestic issues. This is our go-to, one of our go-tos. We always start with this one. In fact, many of their articles could be extemp topics on their own. They cover politics, world affairs, and cultural issues. This is another one that obviously is geared toward the economy, but they write their articles about things that could also affect the economy, so it's a great one. And I would say if you can only afford one subscription, that this is what it should be. So some other sources, some other considerations that you should have. Think about region-specific sources. So for foreign topics, include sources from the region or country, like the Middle East Times, if you're talking about the Middle East peace process. The Financial Times, when you're talking about the international economy. South China Morning Post, if you're talking about Asia. Keep in mind that there are problems with press freedoms in China. And you've got the Statesman, if you're talking about India and Pakistan. All Africa is a great news aggregator. It's not a news source in and of itself, but it brings together stories from more than 40 newspapers from all the countries of the continent. If you're speaking on Australia and New Zealand, consider the Sydney Morning Herald. If you are talking about Europe, particularly Great Britain, The Guardian, although it does have some liberal bias, is a pretty good source for them. You also have BBC News, and there are two different things that I really appreciate about BBC that I will occasionally put in our files. One is country profiles, where they profile the countries, give some background information, some things that have happened with that country in the past that are affecting its present, that sort of thing. And then backgrounders on different issues. That's the same thing. They'll talk about the past of this particular issue. And I think they do a good job with that. Second, you can look for sources that are specific to your topic. Like if you're speaking about politics, go to Roll Call, go to Political Science Quarterly, or the Congressional Research Service. All of these specifically focus on the political arena, and so they'll give you some good information there. And then you've also got Politico, of course, which is a commonly used Extemp source. If you're talking about business or the economy, in addition to The Economist and Financial Times that we've already mentioned, you've got Business Week. They do editorials in every issue that talk about just a really wide variety of issues, but their articles are very good as well. If you get a Texas topic, if you're at UIL State, you can count on there being 2 or 3 in every round. There's some sources for you. Houston Chronicle, Dallas Morning News, Austin American Statesman are old standbys that we've been using for years. And then we talked about the Texas Tribune earlier. That's a little bit more new source that has been very good to us. If you want to talk about education, try Education Next. Talk about education policy and school reform. Think tanks should be high on your list of things to look at. A think tank is a body of experts that provide advice and ideas on specific political or economic problems. They can, however, be funded with very specific agendas. So you will find some like the Heritage Foundation that are a little bit biased. There are about 7,000 think tanks that are out there working. Just watch for your credibility of your authors. We use think tanks because their reports are well researched and have deep analysis. And even if they are biased, their reports tend to be legitimate. Here's a list of some think tanks. We use the Brookings Institute. We use the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We use the RAND Corporation. Actually, every single one on this list we have used at some point or another. I will note that the Heritage Foundation is number 9. So even though we talked about the Heritage Foundation a few minutes ago as being far right in their bias, they're still considered one of the top think tanks. I'm a big fan of the Brookings Institution. We use the Cato Institute frequently. And again, we use the Heritage Foundation as well, even though it is conservative in nature. American Enterprise Institute, American Foreign Policy Council. Okay, so if you're talking science and technology, here are some options for you. CNET, Science Daily, Wired, Scientific American. Now, obviously, these are probably not something that you're going to file on a daily basis. However, if, for example, we're in the midst of a pandemic and you know there are questions that are going to be asked about COVID, go look at the Journal of the American Medical Association and file some articles on that. Use your sources to answer specific questions. For topics on the Supreme Court or the law or legislature, Congressional Quarterly, Harvard Journal on Legislation, SCOTUS blog, The Hill, Roll Call, in addition to some of the ones we've already talked about. Here are some sources if you're looking for good sources on military or the law. There's that Congressional Research Service again. Center for Strategic and International Studies again. If you want to talk on the environment, you've got Energy Policy and the World Resources Institute. I've already mentioned education once, but here are a couple of others. The Chronicle of Higher Education, Education Weekly, the Journal of Higher Education, American Educational Research Council, that's a good one, and then National Education Policy Center. All of those will give you deep analysis and information on education. Just some random ones: the Congressional Budget Office, Economic Policy Institute, American Institute for Economic Research. I would stay away from the National Review. It's a little too far right for many judges. The New Republic is too far left for many judges. The Weekly Standard is highly opinionated. The Week tends to be weaker in its analysis, although we do use this one to sort of keep up with what's going on in the world. Watch out for op-ed articles. Pay attention to your author there. Again, if you've got an economic opinion article that's written by a well-known economist, then that's probably okay. If it's just written by some random person who decided to write into the newspaper, you should stay away from that one. And then check your credentials on your blogs. We've already talked about that some. Be aware to be very careful when you're using articles from these last two. Make sure that you're not quoting from the comments section of that article. Stick with the actual opinion article or blog itself. I think that you should stay away from television media. I think you should stay away from wire sources. And the reason for this is that these sources may be good for building your knowledge of the news, but they do not provide any real in-depth analysis of the news. They're reporting, not analyzing. So you might use Reuters and AP perhaps to report what's going on, but you definitely wouldn't want to use it to analyze it. So I have some suggestions for you on how you might use your sources in a speech. First, I think you should avoid using the same source twice in a speech unless you've done so to show a contradiction, which I talked about a little earlier, or unless both articles are so compelling that you just can't ignore them. If you use the same source more than once in a speech, particularly if you use it multiple times in a speech, it makes your speech seem one-sided. You've only got that one advocacy, and you need more than one advocacy, and you want to straddle both sides of the political aisle so that it is truly not biased. Use sources that are native to your topic area, like all those ones that we just mentioned. I think you should use one source in your intro for your justification or background, and then two sources in each topic area. Your first source in each topic area and each point is to provide the data. You can do that with newspapers or magazines, but again, stay away from on-air news. And then provide a second source in your point that is a higher level source, like a think tank or a journal, that will aid you in your analysis. You should use a total of 7 to 10 points per speech. I would lean more toward the side of 7 as opposed to 10, because if you have more than that in a speech, the speech becomes just source after source after source, and you haven't provided your own analysis in there. So that's overwhelming, the thought of filing all of that stuff that I just listed. So you do have some options for what we call auto filing. And these are Prepped and Extemp Genie. And I'm not going to argue for one over the other because they're very similar in the way they work. They're very similar in the way you use them. We use Extemp Genie, but it has absolutely nothing to do with Extemp Genie versus Prepped. It's except that our school system's technology just won't let us sync Prepped. It blocks it, or it slows it down to the point that it takes us, 3 weeks to download, the last month's worth of sources, where Extemp Genie can go much faster for us. And I don't know why that is. I just gave up trying to figure it out. So we use Extemp Genie. I'm not arguing that you have to use Extemp Genie at all. I think Prepped is very, very good. But what these two platforms do is that they allow you to select the sources that you wish to download, and it will collect all of the articles that came from those sources over whatever period of time, and it files them for you. Now, there is some concern that your speeches are not going to be as good because you haven't done the research yourself. My answer to this is the word practice. We use AutoFile pretty consistently for our team, and I'll put my team's analysis and knowledge of the topics up against pretty much anybody's. And that's because my students are giving so many practice speeches that they've got all the information from the articles that they would have gotten by filing themselves. So use AutoFile, but you've got to practice. If you're not reading and filing yourself, you've got to practice. I do think, in addition to that, that there are some UIL specific considerations that you need to think about when you're using autofiling. And those are things that I think over the years that I've seen selected as topics, especially for UIL state, that you might not catch in autofiling. The first is the obvious Texas-specific topics. There will be Texas-specific topics in every round of UIL competition. District prelims, district finals, region prelims, region finals, state prelims, state finals. You know they're going to be there, but you may not catch the articles with autofiling because I don't think either one of those two platforms that I mentioned a minute ago file any Texas-specific sources. So think about that, file those yourself. Also look for medical-specific topic areas, technology-specific topic areas, science-specific topic areas. Anniversary topics are also pretty common for UIL. So, Roe v. Wade 50 years later, or however long it's been since Roe v. Wade. And then multi-layered topics where you have to deal with not just the United States, but the United States, Russia, and China. Things where you want articles that address a combination of issues in one. So what we do is that we use an RSS reader that will collect articles from either sources that are not part of AutoFile or content that I might be afraid that I might miss. So there are a lot of them. We use Feedly just because years ago when I first started having to do this by hand, that's the one I picked. And so we've been using that one for a long time. But what they will do is that they will save for you all of the articles that were written by whatever news outlet it is that you're not getting autofiled, or sources that you're not getting autofiled. into one place so you can save them by hand. It keeps you from having to go day by day to every single source. It'll pull it all together in one place. And so I would highly recommend that for these kinds of topics that you're looking for that is specifically UIL. I want to thank you for listening today. That's all I've got to say to you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. There's my email address. I'm happy to answer any questions for you, help you in any way that I can. And otherwise, I will wish you all a very pleasant afternoon and weekend, since I'm recording this on a Friday afternoon. Have a great day.